Hi, so I titled my paper Under the Gaze, Space, Power, and Class Politics in Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. To give a little bit of background on how my topic kind of developed, per the recommendation of Dr. Waldrop, I took a look at some of Frederick Jameson's work, particularly an essay called Class and Allegory in Contemporary Mass Culture, Dog Day Afternoon as a Political Film, published in part of a book called Signatures of the Visible. In this essay, Jameson talks about the term figurability, which he takes from Freud and defines as the need for social reality in everyday life to have developed to the point at which its underlying class structure becomes representable in tangible form. So for Jameson, commercial film allows for this figurability, which is particularly important in the postmodern world where such representation, those representations being class structure, is increasingly more difficult to achieve. So for Jameson, essentially, commercial film can make visible class structure. And he demonstrates this in his analysis of Dog Day Afternoon, in which he calls attention to the spatial trajectory of the film, as well as how different characters in that film stand in for different classes. What becomes especially relevant in connecting this essay back to some of the other ideas that we've talked about in this course is in the afterword. When Jameson included this essay in his book, he did so having written it prior to, I think, conceptualizing the book itself. So he's kind of had the opportunity to go back and reflect on his work. And he actually ends up terming his discussion of figurability and the significance of film an early study in cognitive mapping. So this term might be familiar to us from our readings in postmodernism or the cultural logic of late capitalism. It's also brought up by Edward Soja. I like Soja's definition of cognitive mapping a lot. He calls it an ability to see in the cultural logic and forms of postmodernism an instrumental cartography of power and social control. So you think cartography, you think of mapping out space. And while that's something that is often tied to geography, what becomes really important in the postmodern world, because the postmodern world is so fragmented and has the emergence of different kinds of spaces, more conceptual spaces, with the emergence of multinational capitalism and multinational corporations, traditional spatial boundaries that have geographical connections aren't necessarily the best or only type of space that we're engaging with. I know in this class, we've also talked about like online space too. So that also poses, the issue of how to represent those spaces when you can't necessarily be like, oh, here's a physical set of boundaries in this physical space that delineates this area that we're talking about. And so basically cognitive mapping is a means of kind of situating those more conceptual spaces, at least from my understanding of it. And it's really important in the context of postmodernism because of the difficulties, or I guess the differing understandings of space in the postmodern world. So Jameson touches upon that in Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, when he says that a model of political culture appropriate to our own situation will necessarily have to raise spatial issues as its fundamental organizing concern, and then identifies that cognitive mapping is this model. So to kind of bring together what Jameson talked about in his writings on postmodernism and Signatures of the Visible, the reason that he gives so much attention to film is because of its the possibilities of its cultural form. He talks about it being able to kind of represent ideas and space in new ways, and he compares it to the novel, but he also says that the technology available with film, I mean, even the capacity to represent a visual image rather than rely solely on words, gives film this new capacity for expression that is more relevant to our contemporary time than perhaps some writing might be. So it kind of directs us to look at film to see what representation of class structure, what cognitive map of class structure might be present within that film. And that's kind of what I decided to do for my paper. My thesis ended up being, since Jameson identifies commercial film as a space where this aesthetic expression, that aesthetic expression being figurability, as possible, he directs us to examine film through a class point of view that challenges what spatial issues are raised in the film and how those issues contribute to the image of class structure the film impresses. When we analyze Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut through this lens, we see class structure made visible and are made aware of a relationship between space and power that ultimately critiques multinational capitalism. To give a little bit of background on why I picked Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, foremost, it's a really great movie. If you haven't seen it, I would definitely recommend it. But also, kind of the ongoing discussion around Kubrick's work, that particularly that film called attention to the prevalence of class in it, as well as the use of space, which seemed to connect really well to my what I was hoping to kind of look at. So 3 major ideas. The film is set in what Matthias Frey terms millennial WASP New York, which is essentially the spatiotemporal nexus of multinational capitalism. So that immediately establishes a relationship between Eyes Wide Shut and the space and time that Jameson talks about in his scholarship. So this shift in the film's setting also coincides. Well, okay, I'm going to back up for a second and explain that Eyes Wide Shut is based off of a novella by Arthur Schnitzler called Trim Novelle. And that novella is set in Vienna at the turn of the 20th century, whereas Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, as I've just mentioned, is set in millennial WASP New York. So a lot of the scholarship that I encountered talked about that shift, as well as the addition of Ziegler, who is a character. One of my readings called him Mafia-like, and I thought that that was very, very accurate. But Ziegler is added, as explained by Frederick Raphael in a book that he published called Eyes Wide Open. Raphael was the screenwriter for Eyes Wide Shut, so his book talks about his process of writing that movie and also offers some insight on his relationship with Kubrick and Kubrick's personal life. It was an interesting read. So in that discussion, Raphael basically talks about how Kubrick didn't want Eyes Wide Shut to be nothing but a dream, which is what Schnitzler's Trum Novelle ends up being. At the end, the whole plot turns out to be something that has just happened in Fridolin's, who in Eyes Wide Shut in the film version is Bill's head. So, Raphael's attention to this character, this addition of the character of Ziegler, comes alongside this addition of this confession scene, which takes place. I'll offer some background on the plot of the film here. Essentially, the film starts out with Bill, who's played by Tom Cruise, and his wife, who's Alice, who's played by Nicole Kidman, going to this Christmas party thrown by Ziegler. After this Christmas party, they get into this argument about following Alice's confession that she's erotically fantasized about this naval officer the two met on vacation. So Bill ends up wandering into the night and basically finding out about this sex cult and deciding to infiltrate it. So he ends up infiltrating this cult, and basically throughout the course of what follows, he is found out by the cult and then tracked by the cult. And then this is the point where you should skip ahead if you want to be surprised by the movie. He ends up basically having all of these strange things happen to him that show that the cult has control over him. They end up entering his house, and the plot of the film basically ends with him and his wife reconciling in a shopping mall, but him not really ever getting any resolution as to what's happened to him, besides this confession that comes right before he discovers the mask on his pillow, in which Ziegler, that same character who he met at the Christmas party, basically admits that he's responsible for having Bill followed, and knows, offers some insight on what's happened to Bill throughout, this past like 24, 48 hours that he's had all of these weird experiences. So basically that confession scene is, and the character of Ziegler is where a lot of critics like Thomas Allen Nelson and Jack Boozer have talked about the film, establishing a class critique. And, that becomes really important because we've established now, like, the setting plays in really well with Jameson, but also like having some knowledge that the film does engage with class gives some merit to the analysis, right? Finally, space has been noted as important in Kubrick. So Kubrick's cinema has been described as architectonic. And, in Kubrick, it's been described that it's possible to see that the use of the built environment is always both a metaphor and a literal extension of meaning in the film. So, seeing the significance of space come forward, I also thought of as a great way to kind of see a spatial approach to class in the film and kind of extend that approach into my own analysis, which is what I did. I started by looking at the character of Ziegler, and given the significance of architecture and design in Kubrick's films, I decided to situate his socioeconomic status and position that status in relation to other characters in the film by taking a closer look at his domestic space. And I did that basically by comparing these three establishing shots. The one in the middle you'll see is Ziegler's mansion. The one on the left is the Somerton mansion, which is where Bill goes and witnesses the orgy. And then the one on the right is the Harford's apartment building. Basically, comparing and contrasting these spaces makes really clear some stuff about the identity of each character in terms of class. So to start with Ziegler's mansion, this building is in the Beaux Art style. That architectural style is associated with the Gilded Age of the United States and European sophistication. I don't know if Kubrick did that intentionally, but I thought that having that connection to the Gilded Age was really interesting because that era in American history is really connected to excessive wealth, excessive power, and also abuse of workers and individual, like people who are not in positions of power, right? So besides that, the design elements of the building, you look at the molding, you look at the use of, it looks like stone to me, but a very nice stone material. The arched window, the very elaborate entryway. There's just a lot of detail in the building that work alongside its magnanimity to kind of give off a sense of grandeur or opulence. Similar can be said about the Somerton mansion, which you can see this is the best picture I could find, but it's still not the greatest image. There's pillars on the front of the building, and you can see a lot of with the towers on the sides and the detailing in the ceiling, as well as that use of stone. And even just looking at the exterior of the building, the hedging and landscaping is just immaculate. Thomas Allen Nelson offers a really great, I think, comparison of these two spaces when he says that the old world decadence of Somerton parallels the new world opulence of Ziegler's mansion. But collectively, what those two spaces indicate in terms of identity of their inhabitants is this sense of wealth and grandeur and opulence and elitism that positions them among this elite class. The Harford's apartment building, in comparison, isn't quite so opulent. It's definitely a respectable building. It looks to me like a brick or a stone exterior. You might see there's a little bit of an entryway there established, but it's a very plain, basic apartment building, right? It's nothing compared to Ziegler's mansion or Somerton. And ultimately it reflects respectability, but nothing more than the middle class respectability that the Hartfords themselves possess. So this kind of transcends into the interiors of the spaces. These are just some shots of the inside of Ziegler's mansion, just to kind of breeze through them. If you look at the one on the left, you can look at the chandeliers, the arching in the doorway, just the molding on the sides, and the space itself. Like, we're in a ballroom. Who has that in their house? To the right, we see this beautiful staircase, this marble statue. And then up top, we have Ziegler's billiard room, and you can see an oriental rug and this very old artwork and old books, a lot of wood paneling in the space. It kind of gives off like that old money aesthetic. So very clearly exuding that sense of opulence and elitism that Ziegler himself, as a member and kind of like the patriarch of this space, I guess you might say, possesses. So this comes in contrast to the Harford space. I actually listened to this interview with Christiane Kubrick, who's Kubrick's wife, who offered some really unique insight on this space. She talks about how Kubrick actually modeled it after one of their apartments because he wanted it to be really reflective of the middle class, and used her own artwork to kind of give paintings that she made an authentic middle class look to the space. You can kind of see, just thinking back to like the works of art at Ziegler's space versus here. It's not that this art isn't pretty, but it definitely isn't the same old art. It does look a bit more like new, or maybe like just less dated, maybe, if you will. Then the stuff at Ziegler's. And then also the space itself. Raphael talks about a conversation he had with Kubrick in which the two were debating how much Bill Hartford made, and they landed on $200,000 a year. And when they landed on that, Kubrick turned to Raphael and said, don't make their apartment too big. And you can kind of see that. I mean, the bathroom itself is kind of small. I mean, this was a point of kind of debate for me, because you have to think about, I have to think about it in terms of 1999, because a New York apartment this size in 2022, or maybe even in 1999 too, does definitely signal upper middle class. But I think what takes on signification is compare the size of this space to the ballroom at Ziegler's, or even the billiard room. Both of these like massive spaces that are just like decked out in these like very grand design elements. Whereas, it's a little bit more homey at the Harfords, right? So, as Ziegler's mansion, the Harford's apartment building, and Somerton make clear, the class relations among characters in the film, they help make the significance of class more visible in the film's narrative trajectory. So this is where I move into a discussion of Kubrick in space, and basically how he represents spatial boundaries in the film. For my analysis, this use of this particular score, it's a piano cycle. It's the second movement of Georges Liege's piano cycle, is used really strategically by Kubrick to represent what kind of falls underneath the cult's gaze. Essentially, this piano score becomes associated with Bill's surveillance, or the presence of the cult. And this score kind of transcends spatial boundaries, and is, used throughout a lot of different spaces in the film. And it ends up, at least from my reading, ultimately underscoring Bill's powerlessness to the Somerton cult and as a member of New York society. So I'm going to go a little bit more in depth with the first time that we hear the Somerton score, and then I'm just going to breeze through the next few. But essentially, the first time we hear this piece of music is when Bill transitions from voyeur to the object of the gaze. So I'm going to take us back to when Bill is at the Somerton cult. When he initially goes into this space, he goes in and he observes in this big open space this ritual that's taking place. And then he basically moves around the mansion. He enters different rooms. He watches. He's warned by this mysterious woman multiple times that he, should be leaving, but he doesn't. And it's after he has spent some time looking around that he finishes getting warned by the mysterious woman the second time that he should leave, doesn't, and he's summoned away by this figure and basically brought before the cult, essentially for a reckoning. Like, they take him in and find him out and realize that he's not a member. But the way that Kubrick stages the scene, particularly through some close-up shots of masked figures who are cult members staring down the camera, which we understand to kind of be like staring down Bill, and also the way he positions the bodies in space in the room of this film, they end up forming this circle around Bill that encloses him in what an otherwise open space would be, to kind of illustrates how Bill has shifted from the voyeur to the object of the gaze. And as this all comes with the playing of the Somerton score for the first time, we kind of fuse this connection between that piece of music and the gaze of the cult. So I'm only going to do this, show this one clip. I've cut out recording for just 1 second, but I'm going to show a little bit of clip from the movie and kind of unpack that scene. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the video, but at this point, Bill has just been summoned by this masked figure on the pretense that his taxi driver is looking for him, but we soon find out that's not the case. Here we can see them walking. Bill is the one on the right. There's the Summerton score. You can see them all staring at him. And there are these cuts that I was talking about where it's just very evident that these figures are all staring at Bill and he's turned into this object of the gaze.
Please, come forward.
And you can see as Bill comes forward, these figures in the background are going to kind of filter in behind him and enclose him in this circle. It's happening right now. Okay. So you can see he's watched from all sides at this point, but also that Summerton score is continuing.
May I have the password, please?
Okay, so basically what happens from here is that Bill is found out. I'm going to go back to my presentation. Okay. But as you can see from the picture I've included here, Bill is surrounded on all sides. I'll play that again, sorry. And is very clearly the object of the gaze. So something to note here is we can kind of better understand what's happening through Foucault's discussion of space, knowledge, and power. In this discussion, Foucault talks about how people's use of space impacts whether or not a space is oppressive. So what we've kind of seen in this scene is that the ballroom at Summerton has morphed into this sort of prison cell for Bill based off how bodies are positioned in the space. So it is this transition of the space that makes clear that Bill shifted from voyeur to the object of the gaze and also kind of powerless within the situation. I mean, he doesn't have any means of escape until the mysterious woman who actually warned him ends up, she sacrifices herself for him and basically tells the cult that she'll redeem Bill and that he can go and he gets to leave. Okay, so the score repeats in a few occasions, each of them very different locations. Bill decides to go back to Summerton despite being told not to. In this scene, which just to quickly note, Kubrick really offers a lot of really interesting shots of doors in Eyes Wide Shut, which I think plays in really well with the whole idea of spatial boundaries. Here in this scene, the Summerton score plays as Bill approaches the gate to the Summerton mansion, which is locked, barring him out. And we're given a lot of shots of Bill on the other side of the gate, where the gate itself will be like blurred in the foreground of the shot, and then Bill will be in like the medium and like right behind the gate. We get a shot of a security camera, which indicates that Bill is being watched. And then we have this car like creepily approach from the inside of the gate. So it like drives from where the Summerton mansion would be, where Bill is being kept out of. And this figure emerges from the car in photographed on the right and hands Bill this letter basically telling him to stop all of his inquiries. So the score repeats again in the city, this time a public space. As this, in this scene in particular, the camera cuts in between shots of this man in a camel coat, who it becomes really clear is following Bill. Bill looks unsettled in the scene. He looks confused. He turns his gaze. The camera cuts to this man. So it's really clear that he's being followed. And the Summerton score is playing in this scene as well. So we're further drawing that connection between Bill's surveillance, this presence of the cult, and these initial association or uses of this score are important because as it's used again, the connection between the space of Summerton or like Summerton itself and the score is going to become less clear, but we're going to keep that connection that we've drawn earlier and extend it forward. What I mean by that is that the score plays again when Bill finds out about the death of Mandy. So Mandy was a woman that he met at Ziegler's Christmas party. She OD'd in Ziegler's bathroom. He helped her out. Ziegler later in the confession scene discloses that Mandy was the mysterious woman that basically redeemed herself for Bill. But what becomes really important in this scene is that when the music plays, when he finds out about this ex-beauty queen dying in a hotel drug overdose, it insinuates that he's connecting, or there is a connection. I guess we couldn't tell if it was exactly Bill, but Kubrick's making this connection between the cult's presence and this happening, this event. Similar can be said when the mask appears, next to Alice on the pillow. Earlier in the film, this is the mask that Bill wore to the Somerton orgy. He ends up losing it. He goes to return the costume he bought to the costume shop. And he can't find it. Who placed it on the pillow is kind of up in the air. It's one of those things that the film leaves to be a mystery, but the Somerton score plays again during this time. So based off of its prior use, alongside, Bill's surveillance and Somerton, it's pretty clear for us to conclude that there is some connection between the people at Somerton and what's been happening. This connection is really important in this particular instance because we see another spatial boundary subverted by the cult, which essentially is the spatial boundary of the private sphere. Something that I touch upon more in my paper is shots of Bill locking his apartment door. Kubrick, when Bill gets back from the Somerton orgy the first time, gives us this shot of Bill, like not just locking, but also deadbolting the door. And then when Bill arrives home from, the confession scene at Ziegler's, we get another shot of him unlocking it. And that directly precedes this long take that basically ends, it builds up suspense because we're made aware of the mask before Bill is. This long take that precedes Bill's discovery of the mask, which kind of, going back to the door, gives the idea of how did this mask get into this private space. So yeah, basically it does not matter whether Bill is at Somerton in public or even in the private sphere of his own closed and domestic space. He remains under the gaze of the cult. Tracing the gaze of the Somerton cult across public and private space demonstrates the cult's power, reflecting a connection between gaze and power noted by Jameson. Jameson makes this connection in the introduction to Signatures of the Visible on page 2. But basically it's that repetition of the Somerton score that makes that connection between those places and demonstrates that gaze of the cult. So how are we to understand this gaze? For me, it's well understood through Foucault and the panopticon. This topic's come up in our reading, so I'm not going to dwell too heavily on defining it, but it's an architectural model that illustrates the relationship between the sustainment of disciplinary power and the surveillance of the individual. The architectural model was originally developed by Bentham. However, what becomes really important for my analysis is that Foucault writes that the panopticon can't be understood or must not be understood as a dream building, but instead a figure of political technology that may be detached from any specific use. Basically, he talks about panoptic techniques, which include surveillance. So where I land on this whole analysis, I explain it more fully in my paper, is that recalling the scene in which Bill is brought before the cult, we might imagine the positioning of the masked figures and the circle they form around Bill, which ensures he is watched from all sides, as reminiscent of the architectural model of the panoptic tower, whose circular shape is what gives the watch the perception that they could be under surveillance at any time. In the same way that Foucault sees the literal figuration of the architectural model of the panopticon abstract, becoming recognizable as panoptic techniques, so too does the circle around Bill at Somerton abstract, becoming recognizable through signs of Bill's surveillance, indicated by the repetition of the Somerton score, which underscores the social relationship in which Bill is powerless to the cult. So essentially, I've connected that use of the Somerton score to Bill's surveillance, to the cult, which connects to the cult's power over Bill, and basically, through the inclusion of Foucault, illustrates a power dynamic in which Bill is made this object of the gaze, kept under surveillance, and therefore under the disciplinary power of the cult. So to connect this back to class, calls back Ziegler's confession. So here's Ziegler's full circle moment. Right before we get the shot of the mask on the pillow, there's a confession scene in which Ziegler basically tells Bill that he was at Somerton. He's a member of the cult. He's responsible for Bill's surveillance, and Bill needs to stop sticking his nose where it does not belong. And essentially, what we get out of this scene is Bill has a sort of crisis when he realizes that Ziegler kind of has all of this power over him and has known what he's been up to. But this is also where Kubrick's earlier attention to making class visible between Bill and Ziegler through the architectural and design elements of their spaces pays off. Because when Ziegler confesses to Bill that he's a member of the Somerton cult, he gives an unmasked face to all those exercises of power that we've seen the cult direct towards Bill across public and private space. So since this space is attached to an elite social class, a connection between space, power, and social class is made clear. So kind of throw it back to Jameson for a moment. In his analysis of Dog Day Afternoon, Jameson talks about how characters can kind of stand in as representatives of different social classes. And here we kind of see in like a very meta way, Ziegler almost call attention to that very idea of that dynamic as he makes himself the face of this otherwise anonymous, they have masks on, you can't see what their faces are, group of individuals. And when he puts that face on that group, he associates the identity that he's developed throughout the film as this, uber wealthy, very opulent member of the social elite to that whole group of people. And that's something that he talks about in the film too. He talks about the power that these people have and, their social status. But that becomes important because what we see is through that surveillance plot line, there's a connection made between, as I mentioned, space, power, and social class. So Ziegler's or the cult's power over Bill, seen through his capacity to extend his gaze across spatial boundaries through panoptic techniques, is attached to his class position. Likewise, Bill's inability to maintain spatial boundaries to make it matter whether or not he locks the front door of his apartment is connected to his position as a member of the upper middle class. So what has been mapped out in this movie is that wealth comes with an ability for power that basically gives you power over other individuals who are of a lower socioeconomic status. This kind of ties back into Matthias Frey's Millennial Wasp New York, or Frederick Jameson's This Space of Multinational Capitalism. With this setting, this connection between space, power, and social class is attached to New York at the turn of the millennium, or the postmodern space of multinational capitalism. This is the space that Jameson uses to predicate his discussion of the importance of analyzing what film makes visible, figurable about class structure, because it's a space characterized by an immense and decentralized power network. So this decentralized power network recalls the omnipresent gaze of the Somerton cult, which permeates past traditional physical spatial boundaries. Physical, maybe also like geographical would be a way of saying that, creating questions about how to conceptualize space and multinational capitalism. These questions, though, the film surveillance plotline kind of answers by laying out a conceptual space delineated by the gaze of the elite. That's where that connection to the Somerton score comes in. As this space is one in which individuals like Bill are powerless, Eyes Wide Shut ultimately leaves us not just aware of class structure, but critical of the asymmetrical power among individuals within that structure and in the space of multinational capitalism. So that's kind of where my paper concluded. It was definitely a really difficult argument for me to make, but hopefully that made some sense. At the end, I just have my sources listed out. These are everything I referenced in my paper. I didn't end up using everything that I used in my annotated bibliography, but definitely a blend of, Jameson was a really, really big resource for me, as well as Foucault and kind of a blend of Kubrick scholarship. And then here are just all of my image citations. So with that, it was really great working with everyone this semester. I look forward to seeing everyone else's presentations, and thank you so much. Yeah,